In a recent podcast, Dr. Andrew Huberman had some really incredible things to say about God, prayer, science, faith. And in this podcast, I want to interact with some of the things that he said. And at the very end, I want to share with you the one thing that I would challenge Dr. Huberman to examine and take a look more closely at. Stay tuned. All right, everybody, welcome to the podcast. My name is Chad Blackman. This podcast is all about helping you to know, love, and defend the Word. And if this podcast does encourage you, does help answer some questions, if you could like this, if you could share it, whatever platform you happen to be listening to this podcast on, if you could rate it, like it, subscribe to it, follow it, whatever your platform allows you to do to help it, I would greatly appreciate that. It's been really cool to see over the last couple of years some pretty high-profile thinkers start to be moved towards a belief in God. Most notably, over the last year or so, we've seen Dr. Jordan Peterson, who has really started to take steps towards God. He would not be a devout or a devoted Christian by any stretch. Still, in fact, many of his biblical interpretations are very psychological in nature, very kind of pragmatic, practical in nature, if you will. But you have seen him really develop a soft spot for Christian theism, showing the importance of the Bible, the importance of Christianity as the foundation we stand on. And we're seeing now another very high-profile thinker, very, very intelligent man, take steps in a similar fashion. If you don't know who Dr. Andrew Huberman is, he has one of the biggest podcasts in the world right now called the Huberman Lab. Great podcast, very, very informative when it comes to the world of science. Dr. Huberman is over at Stanford University. He is a neuroscientist by trade. And the man has a great podcast. He's a great host, great communicator, and a very, very intelligent man. Well, he was also recently on a podcast with Cameron Hanes. Cameron Hanes is just a beast of a man. The guy's an incredible bow hunter, an incredible athlete. And Cam was talking with Dr. Huberman, and the topic of God and prayer and faith came up. And Andrew Huberman had some really interesting things to say. Let's listen here to this first clip from that podcast.
Okay. When you start to study and understand brain development, as I did, or neuroplasticity, or dopamine, you have to, meaning I don't care if you're an atheist, agnostic, or believer in creator, you have to step back and just go, wow. Now, then of course there's this difference among scientists as to who believes in God, who doesn't. I'll just go on record. I'm very comfortable saying it. I believe in God. I do. I think there are many things that science can explain. There are certain things science can't explain. But I'll even go a step further, which is that all the elements of science are entirely compatible with the idea of there being a God. And I'm not the first scientist to say this. I mean, Einstein believed in God. Carl Jung, one of the greatest psychologists ever, clearly believed in God.
Now, I remember the first time hearing this podcast, hearing this clip, and I was just so excited about what Andrew Huberman was saying. There are so many cool aspects of this conversation, and this clip is just a highlight of some of them. Really, there are three major issues here that Huberman addresses, and he did it so fast, and I mean, this is just like a minute clip, but these three topics are just so massive, and they've been so important in my own life and my own development, and I wanted to take a moment here to just kind of walk through some of the things that he said. Dr. Huberman makes this statement. He says there are things science can explain, and then there are things that science cannot explain. And this to me is such a helpful like grid, a helpful framework for understanding what science can do and what science cannot do. And this is coming from a man who is a very highly trained scientist. Oftentimes in the religious world, especially with Christians, we can see science as the enemy. We can see science as something bad, as something that's only practiced by like these, hedonistic pagans that don't want anything to do with God. And that's really not a fair assessment of science. Science is really, really, really good at discovering and explaining processes. Science is very, very good. The scientific method is very powerful in discovering how things work, explaining the mechanism and the process of how things work and function. And it can do that very, very well. And that's great. That gives us very helpful information. I would be very happy to go on record. I do not want to live in a world that is devoid of science. Some of the technological and medical advancements that science has produced have been a huge blessing to mankind. And I love that he kind of puts that out there. There are things science can do well. And just like any other field of study, there are things that science cannot do well. Science's great lack, its great deficiency, is in answering some of the more deeper, we'll use some big words here, we'll use like philosophical or metaphysical, some of the more spiritual questions that humans have. Science does a really poor job answering those things because it's not designed to answer those kinds of questions. And I think this is what Huberman's trying to get at. Science can explain a lot, but then there's so many other aspects of life that science just can't get to. And when scientists do try to answer into these spaces, you can quickly see the deficiency of science. I'll give you a couple of examples here. Philosophers oftentimes will say there's 4 great questions every human has to answer. Who am I? Where do I come from? Why am I here? Where am I going? Those are the 4 massive questions we all have to wrestle with. Who am I? What's my story? What's my deal? What exactly am I? Where do I come from? What is my origin? Why am I here? What is the purpose of being here? And here's the $1 million question. What happens after death? What happens when I die? Now, in a purely scientific, naturalistic worldview, who am I? Well, that's just, we're cosmic stardust. That's all we are. We're the product of this massive explosion that happened billions of years ago. We're just basically high-functioning carbon. We're high-functioning pond scum that has evolved into the form that we are today. Where do we come from? Well, we come from this cosmic accident. Why am I here? There is no purpose for why I'm here. This is all just a giant accident. There's no greater future. There's no greater purpose. There's nothing really to us. It doesn't matter if you live till you're 80 and you're successful and you're smart, or if you die in your 20s. We have no greater purpose or future in front of us. And where am I going after death? Well, according to a purely scientific worldview, you just turn back into dirt. You go back to the soil, back to the fertilizer pit. Now, I respect an atheist who can hold that worldview and really adopt it. Because there's something, at least in my heart and in the majority of people I've found, there's something about answering those 4 questions with just a scientific worldview that causes discomfort. It's like, no, man, I feel like I am more than just cosmic stardust. I feel like I do have purpose. I feel like there is a greater reason for why I'm here. And this to me is a really helpful like a differentiation, a grid to think of science. Science can do things really well, but man, it just lacks in explaining some of the deeper, important questions of life. And I think this is really helpful here to think about. Huberman also makes this statement. He says, all the elements of science, they're compatible with the potential that there is God, that there is a God. And so I love that he breaks down this dichotomy that oftentimes exists either with the scientist towards the believer and sometimes with the believer towards the scientist. This dichotomy, or this 2 sides of the coin, looks like this. Well, I have science and you have faith, and the 2 can't exist together. Or vice versa. I have faith and you have science. And Huberman goes, no, no, no. These two things complement each other. Science is really good explaining parts of reality, but then faith and theology and philosophy is really good at explaining other areas of life that science can't really get to. It's not really designed to touch on those things. And so I love that he puts this out there of like, no, 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 no. There's nothing about the pursuit of science that should hinder you from then the pursuit of faith in God as well. And he names a couple of famous scientists, and I just wanted to add a couple of scientists to this list here. Dr. Francis Collins, huge contributor to the Human Genome Project. Dr. John Lennox, Oxford mathematician, one of the greatest mathematical minds in the world, is a devout Christian. Dr. Hugh Ross, one of my favorite speakers and writers and authors. This guy is a Caltech-trained astrophysicist, an incredibly brilliant astrophysicist, and he's a devout follower of Christ. And so to say that science and faith can't coexist together, that they're opposed to each other, to me is just a silly thing to try and throw out there. Now, with that being said, I do oftentimes think scientists will try to take the intellectual high ground because they don't want there to be a God. And at the same time, we have a lot of Christians or theists who are intellectually a little bit lazy and soft, and they don't want to dig into some of the pressing questions science brings up. And so I do think that's out there. However, I don't see any reason why science and faith can't coexist, because here's the deal. The truth is the truth. Christians should not be afraid of the truth. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. Whatever's pointing to truth is on our side. And so I love that he kind of lays that out there, that there's no element of science that's not compatible with the potential there's a God. And then he starts talking about, and this is one of my favorite parts of the whole clip, he starts talking about how amazing the brain is, how amazing the body is. And he's like, as a neuroscientist, I look at the brain and just go, oh my goodness, how incredible is this thing? And I would 100% agree. I am by no stretch a neuroscientist that works at Stanford. I'm just a measly little paramedic, but even in my little studies that I've done in physiology and anatomy, learning how the body interacts, tries to maintain homeostasis, it's unbelievable what the body is capable of. It's unbelievable the intricacy and the complexity that's within the human body. Just like if you just flex your bicep, this is so crazy to me. You have an electrical signal firing from your brain down your spinal cord, going to those muscles, and then what's happening in those muscles, there's this exchange of like sodium and potassium and calcium, and that's creating this electrical difference, this switch in polarity, and that switch is then what's causing your muscle to contract. Just to flex your bicep, that simple action of flexing your bicep, that's so complex, it's so advanced. And Huberman is rightly saying, this is incredible. How could you look at something this complex and think there isn't a complex designer behind it? And I would just go, absolutely, Huberman. In fact, I would take this even a step further. Dr. William Lane Craig has been so helpful in advancing the fine-tuning argument. The fine-tuning argument basically goes like this. The necessary preconditions for the universe to exist are so specific. They're so finely tuned for any kind of potential for life to exist that the only logical explanation is that there was someone behind the scenes who finely tuned all of the dials in to let life exist. And I want to try to explain this a little bit clearer here. Dr. Craig throws out just some incredible numbers. He talks about the gravitational constant. This is a constant in physics, as certain physicists do their mathematics and calculations. This is a number so specific that if it was changed just a hair's breadth, I mean just a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a fraction, what you would have is a gravitational force so strong or too weak that the universe would not be able to exist. And to give you an idea here, this number is 1 in 10 to the 60th power. So the best way I know how to explain this, like if you think of your oven has all these dials, right? Like 250, 300, 350, 400. It's got these temperatures on it. Okay, imagine a dial that has 1 with then 60 zeros behind it. That's how many notches are on the dial. That's a lot of notches. And what this gravitational constant, what this idea, this fine-tuning idea is saying, is that if you turn the dial 1 click to the left or 1 click to the right and it's out of balance, the entire universe would not be able to exist. And it's not just the gravitational constant, the expansion rate of the universe, the rate that the universe is currently expanding outwards. That number, once again, 1 in 10 to the 120th power. If that rate was 1 click on the dial to the left or 1 click on the dial to the right, and we're talking about a dial with 120 zeros on it. 1 with 120 zeros. That is a astronomically high number. And you've got a fraction of a fraction of a fraction, a hair's breadth difference one way or the other. The universe would expand into oblivion or collapse back in on itself. And so I would say, Andrew Huberman, Dr. Huberman, you're absolutely right. You are seeing reality for what it is. The complexity of biology. Look then at the complexity of cosmology and physics. This universe we live in is so finely tuned, so set up for the existence of humankind. How could you explain this outside of there being a creative mind behind all of this? I think the most logical explanation is that there really is a creator behind all this. I want to show you 2 more clips here, and then we'll wrap up with one final question that he needs to answer, and also we as believers need to answer. Let me show you this next clip.
I mean, we could talk a bit about how well, I'll just say this. Secretly, I've always prayed. I grew up in a split religion home. My family's like the UN. We've got people from Guatemala, Denmark, Argentina, New York. Like all the different political battles are in my family. Super left, super right, libertarians, lefties to the, it's crazy. Thanksgivings can be difficult.
Yeah.
But I'll say this, I absolutely pray. I absolutely love that the idea, but also what for me is really a deep belief, which is that we can't control everything. We're not in as much control as we think we are. And that the magnificence of biology and the magnificence of nature is, it's impossible for me to conceive how that could come about any other way.
So I love this clip here because as a scientist, he has an unbelievable display of humility here. He makes the statement, I like looking at Christianity, at religion. I like this idea that we're not in as much control as we think. And that to me is such a beautiful display of humility. Like this guy who's got a PhD from Stanford, one of the biggest podcasts in the world. And he's sitting there and has the humility to go, you know what? As smart as we are and as much technology as we have, there are so many things outside of our control. There are so many mysteries and so many forces at play here that we just don't understand. And I just wanted to applaud him for having that kind of humility. And then I love how he talks here about marveling at biology. He just looks at this, and this kind of goes back to this first clip. He repeats this theme. He's looking at this thing just going, oh my goodness, the human body, the biology. I look out in the world, this is so incredible. And what is cool about this is literally what we're seeing in Huberman is actually directly talked about in the Bible. Romans chapter 1 says, right about verse 20, if my memory serves me correctly. Romans 1:20, it says that through creation, so everything that we look out in the created world, the natural world, astronomy, physics, biology, chemistry, we look out into the natural world, and Paul, almost 2,000 years ago, is writing God's divine attributes, his invisible attributes, his eternal power, this aspect about God that's kind of hard to see because he's spirit and he's transcendent of us. Paul says if you look out at the created world, what you'll be able to see is God's invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature. And he says it's clearly seen through creation. And I was just like blown away when I first saw this clip, because Huberman is expressing that. Huberman is literally living out Romans chapter 1. And it was so cool to see that. Like, here's a guy who has the intellectual honesty to look at the world and go, my goodness, look at the complexity here. Look at the design. Look at how amazing this is. And it spurred his heart on to go, man, there's got to be something else beyond us. And I just think that's really cool. I got one more clip for you. We'll work through this, and then I got just one of the most important questions I could ever ask you.
Who do you pray to?
That's an interesting one, because I think God. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I absolutely do. I've actually started reading the Bible recently, start to finish. I feel like it's my duty to like learn and in some sense compare Old and New Testament. Mm-hmm. I'm really interested in the stories, but I'm fascinated by the story of us, right? And the story of everything. And so, but yeah, I pray out loud in the morning, sometimes again in the middle of the night if I wake up. Mm-hmm. And it's only recently that I've been doing this more often.
It's giving you peace?
Oh, my goodness. It's given me so much. It's given me peace. And, this is going to sound weird, and probably people are going to be like, what are you talking about? If this, it works. Mm-hmm. It works.
So I love here that Cam Haynes just goes right for the jugular. He's like, all right, well, tell me who you pray to. He's like, that's really cool you're praying, but who exactly do you pray to? And Huberman responds, well, I pray to God. And then he says, I've been starting to read the Bible, and he makes this statement. He's like, I feel like it's my duty to read the Old Testament and then read the New Testament. And I love that he's doing this. I think this is so cool. I think maybe some Christians would be a little bit uncomfortable with this because we're spooked by the Old Testament. It's kind of weird. It seems like God's really grumpy, even though the bloodiest book in the whole Bible is Revelation, the New Testament. I would so encourage him to go, yes, man, read the Old Testament. And I think you're going to be blown away how much the New Testament harkens back to the Old Testament. All kinds of Jewish scholars, all kinds of Bible scholars throughout the years have said one of the most amazing things about the New Testament is just how much it's like the Old Testament. And here's what I would encourage Huberman to do, and maybe you as well, as you're trying to work through the Old Testament. One of the most helpful bits of advice that was ever given to me in reading the Old Testament, because I will be straight, there's some weird stuff in there. The Old Testament does have its spots where you're like, what in the world is this all about? Here's one of the most helpful reading principles going through the Old Testament. The Old Testament is page after page after page foreshadowing Christ. That's what the whole Old Testament's about. The entire Old Testament is like this flashing neon sign. Jesus is coming. Jesus is coming. The Messiah is coming. Here's what he's going to look like. Here's what he's going to do. Here's prophecies about where he'll be born, what kind of ministry he's going to do, what kind of death he's going to die. Here's what the Messiah is going to look like. Jesus is coming. Jesus is coming. And if you read the Old Testament with that framework, with that lens, it helps clarify a lot of the weird stuff. When you read through some of the sacrificial things, you're like, what in the world am I reading this for? When you start reading through the genealogies, the genealogies, man, can be so hard to get through. You're like, why is this here? All of those things are pointing forward to Christ. The genealogies are important because it's showing how meticulous the Jews followed lineage, how closely they tracked where people came from. And why that's important is because later on, when prophecies would be made that Christ is going to come from the line of David, from the tribe of Judah. David would be a descendant of Jacob, who would be a descendant of Isaac, who would be a descendant of Abraham. Those family lines can literally be tracked back. And all of those genealogies are like showing you, look, man, look how meticulous these people followed lineage. The whole sacrificial system, it's all foreshadowing of Christ. Jesus is coming. All throughout the Old Testament, figures like David. David is like this little mini foreshadowing of Christ to come. This shepherd who's a king and has this unbelievable display of like a warrior, but he's also a poet and a musician, and he has like this beautiful, well-rounded aspect to himself. And then Christ would be the greater David. Christ would be the one who is both the lion and the lamb, the one who is meek and mild and humble, but is also a conquering warrior who will come back and judge the world for sin and righteousness. Like, there's all of these little foreshadowings through the Old Testament. And I think one day what I'd love to do is go through just like chapter after chapter, verse after verse of all of these little mini pictures of Christ to come. So I would share that with Dr. Huberman. Hopefully that would help you make sense of a lot of what you're reading. And then, man, when you get to the New Testament, you're going to see, oh my goodness, that Christ fulfilled that. Oh my goodness, Christ did this because that was what the Old Testament was talking about. Then I love that he says he has experienced so much peace from prayer. That to me is what a powerful testimony. This guy who, man, he's got kind of the world in the palm of his hand. I mean, he's a doctor. He's got a massively popular podcast, and he's like, yeah, none of that's really bringing me peace, but prayer does. And it makes me think back to what Jesus said. He says, my peace I leave with you, not as the world gives, but as I give. And all through the scriptures, especially in the New Testament, we're called to cast our anxieties on to him, to take what's burdening us, to take what wears us down, and literally lay it before the Father, lay it before him and go, here, you carry this anxiety, you carry this burden for me. And I love that he ends here by saying prayer, he goes, man, it works. Like, it works. This is a guy who's scientifically minded. This is a guy who's all about come up with a hypothesis, test the hypothesis. Can you repeat the results? And I love that he just goes, dude, it works. I don't know how else to say this. Like, prayer works. And that's, once again, right out of the scriptures. James chapter 5, the prayers of a righteous man are powerful and effective. That's not to say that prayer is like a genie in a bottle. Prayer will not just get you whatever you want. That's not how it works. But the connection with the divine, the peace that it can bring, the direction that it can give to you, really the ultimate purpose of prayer is to reorient your heart back to God's will. And it's a spiritual practice of saying, Lord, your will be done. Help me know and follow what your will is, instead of just always asking about what my will is and always trying to get what I want. So love what Dr. Huberman had to say. This podcast was just so encouraging to me, and would recommend you go check it out. Here's the one question that I would ask for Dr. Huberman. I would challenge him to really investigate this. He said in the clip that he prays to God, which is super cool. However, it's a little bit vague. It's a little bit ambiguous. Which God? There's a lot of different gods out there. Which God are you praying to? And here's the most important question he could ever answer, or you and I could ever answer. And it's a question, in fact, that came straight from the mouth of Christ. Christ was hanging out with his disciples. He had his 12 guys. They're walking around the countryside, and he asks his disciples, hey, who do the people say that I am? And they start chiming in. A couple guys say, oh, well, you're a prophet, or you're John the Baptist, you're Elijah. They start throwing out all of these things, right? You're a teacher, you're a philosopher, you're a prophet, you're all these things. And Jesus doesn't really engage any of that stuff. And then Peter chimes in, and Peter says, you're the Christ. You're the Christ. You are the Son of God. And Jesus says then to Peter, "Blessed are you, Peter. You have not discovered this by yourself. Rather, it has been revealed to you." And this question, who do you think Jesus is what I would ask Dr. Huberman to investigate. Who exactly is Jesus of Nazareth? Who is this man? Because C.S. Lewis said it so brilliantly. Lewis, I can't remember which work it was. Let's see, it might be Mere Christianity. Lewis explains Jesus doesn't give you the option of relegating him to prophet, teacher, philosopher, good human. He doesn't give you that option. Jesus makes all kinds of claims throughout the New Testament that he is God in human flesh. John 8:58 is the clearest example of that. He literally says, before this whole council of Jewish scribes and Pharisees, before Abraham was, I am. I am. He's quoting back to Exodus chapter 3. That's literally the name God uses. It's where we get the word Jehovah or Yahweh from. So he says, man, I am before Abraham. I am God. And then if you read the text, they pick up stones and try to kill him because they realize this guy just claimed to be God. So Lewis goes on to say, Jesus doesn't give you the option to put him in the classification of like Confucius or Buddha or any of these other figures. Lewis says, if you're being intellectually honest, you have to admit he is either a lunatic, like the guy is off his rocker, he is crazy. He's a liar, so he knows he's not God, he's just a psychopath, he's just a sociopath, he's bold-faced lying to all these people, or he's Lord. Lunatic, liar, or Lord. Those are your three options for Jesus. And I would challenge Dr. Huberman to look at the life of Christ, look at how he lived, look at the miracles that he did, look at the ethics that he taught, look very closely at the evidence for the resurrection of Christ. I'm not saying believe the resurrection because I told you to, believe the resurrection because I'm threatening you with hell. That is not what I'm saying. I'm saying look at the actual evidence for the resurrection. What blew me away about the resurrection of Christ is that all of the apostles, after Jesus died and rose and went to heaven, their argument for faith in Christ was that they saw Christ resurrect from the dead. They were eyewitnesses of it. They were not the only eyewitnesses. They appeal throughout the New Testament, most notably 1 Corinthians 15. They appeal that there are some 500 other witnesses to the resurrection of Christ, that he really did come back from the dead. That is a powerful argument, because what these first century disciples of Christ were saying is that you don't have to take our word for it. There are other people who saw him. They will corroborate, they will support, they will back up what we're saying to you. You can fact check us. And what blows me away is that if these guys were lying and the resurrection didn't really happen, they should have been discovered as frauds. Rather, what we see is that the gospel, Christianity, explodes in the first century. Despite persecution, despite active hostility from Jews and Romans, this thing spreads like wildfire. And it was spreading on the basis, we saw him resurrect. You don't have to take our word for it. Go fact check us. That's a powerful, powerful piece of evidence to wrestle with. Not to mention all of the other pieces of evidence, the fact that Jesus was buried in a very public tomb. Joseph of Arimathea, everybody knew who that guy was, popular man. You could go see that the tomb was empty. I mean, there's a lot of different pieces of evidence that go into this, but for the sake of time, I'll leave it right here. Who exactly is Jesus of Nazareth, Dr. Huberman? I would highly encourage you to look into that. And I'll end with this. Jesus in Mark chapter 12 has this cool interaction with a Pharisee, a scribe, actually, I believe. And the guy asks him, "Teacher, what's the greatest commandment?" And Jesus says, "To love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. And the second one is like it, to love your neighbor as yourself." And the religious leader responds by saying, you know what? You're right. That is the greatest commandment. To love the Lord your God with all your being, with everything you've got, and to love your neighbor is far greater than sacrificing. And Jesus looks at him and says, you have answered wisely. You are not far from the kingdom of heaven. And I would say the same thing to Dr. Huberman. Dr. Huberman, you have answered very wisely on this podcast. You are not far from the kingdom of heaven. Hey, wait. Before you go, if you could please consider subscribing, liking, rating, following, doing whatever you can do on the platform that you're listening to this podcast on to help this get out to more people. I would really, really appreciate that. It helps me grow this podcast and helps this information edify and build the body of Christ. And that one small little step is a great help on your part to help this get out to more people. Thanks for listening. I'll see you on the next one.